Hello and welcome to the Cosmology of Light channel. I'm Praveer, and today I'm going to offer a commentary on a TEDx talk that I did a couple of months ago in September, and this was for TEDxBeaconStreet, and the talk was titled "The Power of Light to Make Change Happen." And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to play the talk and essentially just pause it and offer some comments as we go along. So launching it now.
There is a great power in light to make change happen. My journey toward this discovery began when I was a child.
So just pausing here, there's a great power in light to make change happen. So that really is the invitation here. And what I'm going to go over right now in this talk is the beginning of the journey by which this discovery became possible for me to really see that there is potentially power in light to practically make change happen. So here's the experience that actually launched me on this journey early on.
Oftentimes, when I had fever, I would have a similar experience in which I would see myself in a slowly falling drop of water. And in this drop of water, I would see myself in another drop of water, and this would continue recursively. And as a result, my perception of space and time would change, and all of a sudden it felt like I had popped out of space and time into this calm realm which was just defined by peace. And I began to associate this realm with light.
Okay, so pausing here. So the experience that I had often when I was quite young, I would, as far as I can recall, from about ages 5 to maybe 8 or so, and this would always happen when I had a fever, was essentially that I would often see myself in a drop of water, and this would be slowly falling, as I've described. But the point is that it was a fractal experience because I would see myself in a drop of water and then see myself in another drop of water inside that drop of water, and this would go on. So just try and imagine this was a mind of a child, barely 5 to 6 years old, where the experience is translated in such a way that it appears like it's a drop of water slowly falling, and then as a result, space and time change, and then somehow in that mind of the child or the experience of the child is popping out of space and time into some other realm, which then he associates with light. So the instrumentation that's available to perhaps a 5 to an 8-year-old is something different than perhaps a 50 or a 60-year-old who's had the benefit of life experience and perhaps all kinds of practical learnings and things. So keep that in mind, that experience was an experience from a 5 to 8-year-old, and we'll come back to the ramifications of that in a few minutes.
It wasn't until years later when I got introduced to Einstein's theory of relativity and his description of the constant speed of light and how space and time can change based on how close they approach that speed, that it occurred to me that I may have been experiencing this theory of relativity viscerally as a child.
So I'm going to pause there. Yeah, it was years later, and only when I began to study science, and even then that was not enough, but when I began to get naturally interested in the phenomenon of light, that the implication, or rather what Einstein had framed as his theory of relativity, became more real for me, the understanding of that. And then I could reflect back on the experience that I had. And I want to make a comment here, and that's that up till that time when Einstein stated his theory of relativity, so about 100 years ago, the belief for centuries, based on a Newtonian view of the universe, was that there is absolute space and absolute time. And these then became given, and even though the theory of relativity was elaborated over 100 years ago, still in the common mind of people, there's still an absoluteness to space and time that is the belief of how time and space operate. So this notion where a scientist or where an Einstein says that, hey, space and time are not absolute, they're relative. And in fact, what he suggested was that the absolute in the picture was the speed of light. And as an object gets closer to that speed, then space and time begin to change. And now, if we reflect back to that mind of a 5 year old or a 6 year old, where that experience was, you can say that it was a similar kind of experience, but it just happened viscerally because the whole notion of space and time, something triggered a change in how space and time are perceived, and this trigger appeared to be this fractal experience of the child seeing himself in smaller and smaller confines of space and in a different elaboration of time. And as a result, there was a popping out of space and time. And so this is, I think, similar to what Einstein was stating in his theory of relativity. And what's remarkable about his theory is that it's a, it represents a complete break from a paradigm that people take for granted. And I think that even when we consider what light is, there's a certain perception of what light is. It's scientifically supposed to be electromagnetic spectrum and all the waves and frequencies within that, and that's defined as light. But the question is that really what light is? And that's what I want to kind of tease out here, is that light is something entirely different. So that's this personal journey that I'm describing in this TEDx talk is a journey to move from one vicinity or area or way of thinking or set of perceptions to another set of perceptions that is triggered by an experience that's personal. So let's move on.
So I got very interested in light and I wanted to understand it much more deeply. Some of the things that I found were pretty astounding to me. One, every single atom in the universe, whether of animate matter or inanimate matter, is forged either in the light of the suns or the math of supernova.
Pausing here quickly. So this figure or this illustration here is, in a sense, you can see the periodic table. So the idea being that every single element that's represented by that periodic table has a signature of light inside it. And so we see in the backdrop the entire, that's a representation of the universe in a sense, and the elements are what creates the physical reality in this universe, but they themselves have been forged in the light of the suns or the math of supernova. And where this is moving to as we look further in this video is the idea that light, we have to think about light differently. Light is fundamental. So let's move on.
In other words, what we are, what everything is, deeply has light inside it. If I consider a small iota of space around me, it's packed with millions of photons. And these photons we know are carriers of light. So these photons carry infinite amount of information from the surrounding environment, stream this through our eyes, and recreate in our brains an image of the world. In other words, the action of photons deeply grounds us in one massive light-based operating system.
So pausing here. So far there's two things being said about light. One is that everything by definition, whether it's animate or inanimate, has light inside it down to the fundamental level of the atom. The second thing is that through the action of photons, we're all grounded in a massive light-based operating system. And so what these suggestions are getting at is that the reality of light, which is ubiquitous, and even when we, based on the science that we've discovered so far, this ubiquity becomes present. We don't call it that. We don't really realize that in our common language or common experience. But the fact being that light is intimate to everything, and light is a foundation from which everything arises in a sense and is grounded in this operating system. So we do need to think about light in a fundamentally different way, and that's what's beginning to be pointed out here.
Even if we consider nutrition of all living beings, we can trace it back to a simple process called photosynthesis, which again depends on the light of the sun. So it's fair to say that without light, we wouldn't exist. But even if we
So the third point here, and these 3 points, when you consider them in juxtaposition, the fact of all matter, inanimate or animate, being fundamentally having light deeply embedded inside it, the fact of light operating all around us through the action of photons and grounding us in a massive light based operating system, and the fact that any living being is dependent on light and tracing back to a simple nutritional process of photosynthesis means that without light, any living being simply by definition, or for that matter, any kind of matter wouldn't exist if light didn't exist in the first place.
consider our current environment, the infrastructure that exists technologically is derived from different wavelengths of what we call the electromagnetic spectrum, which is another word for light. So whether technology is based on radio waves or microwaves or infrared or visible light or ultraviolet or X-rays or gamma rays, these all derive from light. And without it, our current world wouldn't be what it is. Even if we extrapolate.
So the point there is that not only is everything that we are dependent on light, but even the entire infrastructure of the world, a lot of what drives our common conveniences of today are a result of understanding light more deeply. And as I suggested before, the scientific definition of light is these electromagnetic waves that travel at a speed of 186,000 miles per second. And that's how scientifically we understand what light is. And interestingly, the source of these electromagnetic waves is often thought to be jumps in electron orbits around atoms themselves. So, in the scientific point of view, atoms existed, um, and then a light emanates from it. But that's somewhat of a chicken and egg scenario because atoms can't exist unless they're forged in the light of the sun. So if we just think about it from that perspective, a light has to be more fundamental than atoms, or the existence of light is something that's independent of the action of atoms. Yet, scientifically, when we think about light, we're always thinking in terms of the radiation emitted from activity in the around based on the electron orbits in the atom itself. So, the point being is that science, if we go back to the example of Einstein and the break from absolute space time to relative space time, is that we're on a journey, and we simply can't take many of our quote unquote scientific facts as facts forever. There's going to be experience that people have that will fundamentally challenge the perception of what's real and what's not. So moving forward.
Into the future, then it's been said that quanta and optics are going to be instrumental in the future. And both these things, quanta and optics, are derivative from light. And so without light, neither our past would exist, nor our current, nor our future. And yet, we barely consider light. We don't have a conscious relationship with it. The question is, if this was reversed, if we began to develop a conscious relationship with it, what kind of new technologies would evolve as a result, and how would our lives be different?
All right. So pausing there, the third point in the current, past, future layout was that the future itself is also, by many accounts and narratives, supposedly going to be heavily dependent on technologies that are based on quanta and optics. But if you think about quanta and optics, they're both derivative from light itself. So again, it's showing its face. This ubiquity of light, the the need to understand light in a fundamentally different way is surfacing again. And I'll ask a philosophical question at this point: is that if we see that light is this ubiquitous medium, that it is required for our past, for our current, for our future to be what they are, then wouldn't it make sense, just if we think about it, that light is much more fundamental than perhaps we've even imagined to date. And so that's the point of kind of showing these surfacings of light's action in creating our past, our present, and our future, is that perhaps we just haven't simply thought about light adequately enough, and it's just much more fundamental. So then the point being is that if we can begin to penetrate into what light really is and begin to understand it in a completely different way, then what kind of sciences, what kind of technologies, what kind of practical applications can result from this reframing of what light is. So continuing, oops, sorry, having some technical issue here. Let's go back. There we are. Sorry about that.
Now,
Yeah.
one day, many decades ago, I was experiencing a very difficult relationship with somebody, and I was at my wits' end about what to do. I was in India at the time, and I was sitting under a big tree, and all of a sudden it occurred to me to begin to see this person in a sphere of light. So I did that for a few days, and then almost by miracle, she began to treat me entirely differently.
Okay, so just pausing there. So here's a scenario that I'm suggesting that is due to a different kind of relationship with light. So up to this point in this talk, I had suggested that light is fundamental to the past, the present, the future, and the implication being that that light is much more basic to our existence. And since it's present in everything, we can develop a different kind of relationship with it. Now, here, just spontaneously, there's a something that occurred by which that relationship, the different kind of relationship that each of us can have with light, surfaces in this experience of healing a relationship that I describe.
Now, I could call that a miracle or could seem miraculous, but I believe that I had actually tapped into a fundamental technology of light, a repeatable process by which some physical circumstances had changed a result of my imagining things in light. So,
So here, the point being that the boundaries of science and technology are should never be thought of as absolute, and experience, personal experience that many people have, is going to drive how our body of knowledge itself changes and how we might represent phenomena through science and its technological applications. Now, what seemed like a miracle in a sense of this act of envisioning somebody in a sphere of light, I'm proposing is actually a technological process, and it's a repeatable process that can have, in a sense, somewhat predictable results if it's done in a certain way. So that's the definition of it, of technology, is tapping into or making clear a process that has a particular set of inputs and a particular mechanism by which it operates, and then as a result of that, going through those mechanisms, a particular kind of output, and that can be termed as a technology. It's a repeatable process. So here, the technologies of light can be entirely different and can there's a wealth of different possibilities that might surface, and this experience that I described is just suggesting something at the tip of the iceberg.
Armed with these experiences, the fractal experience of the drop within a drop as a child, and now this multidimensionality of light, where imagination made something physically change, I really wanted to express or articulate what I was perceiving as this power in light. So I began a journey of articulating this, and I chose the medium of mathematics because it appealed to me as a more artistic way to begin to capture what light is. So I wrote a series of 10 books that belong to this cosmology of light set and
Just pausing there. So I wanted to contrast this kind of articulation with the articulation in the mind of a child. So there was an experience that this child had when we started off with the video, where the child was experiencing, in his perception, a drop within a drop within a drop, and seeing himself in it. And that was the extent of how a certain fractal reality and a mathematics of light could be imagined, even though that experience was, I believe, something to do with light, yet the ability to articulate it was, certainly um, minimal, based on the experience of the child to date. But articulation of 10 books in a mathematical language is due to years of experience and years of study, and essentially it's describing the same experience, and but using a more sophisticated language to do so.
basically in that framework, what occurred to me is that light has a fundamental place. Everything arises from light. Light's native state is something where it travels infinitely fast. And in that state, there's infinite amount of information and potential, and light can project itself at slower speeds. And then through the
So here's an articulation of, or rather a proposal for what light is. And light is something that's exists natively in a state where it travels infinitely fast. And then there's projections of different layers of light, and there's an arbitration of information from one layer to the other. And this arbitration takes place through a device that we call quanta. And so, what's being suggested here in just a brief couple of minutes is a different way to think about light and a different way to think about quanta.
device of quanta, some of that infinite potential can materialize where light projects itself at slower speeds. And we know that in our universe, light is scientifically known to travel at a constant speed of 186,000 miles per second. And to me, that's deliberate, that's an intentionality so that materialization can occur in a certain way. But
So, going further in this articulation of what I call a cosmology of light, there's an intentionality. It's not random that light travels at 186,000 miles per second. There's a particular purpose to it, and that purpose is simply so that a particular kind of materialization can occur and create the richness of this physical universe within which we exist. And so, what's being suggested here in this brief minute is that you have all this infinite potential where when light exists as at its native state of traveling infinitely fast, and so there's an infinite amount of information in that state, and that information progressively gets more and more material as light projects itself at slower and slower speed, and this happens through the device of quanta, and then that richness that exists in light in its native state can manifest in a particular kind of materiality that we experience physically. So this is also a suggestion that there's different kinds of materiality that may be uh, more and more subtle, so less and less material as you kind of go back to the antecedent layers of light. But certainly the way quanta works, and while it's not mentioned in this talk, but I'll quickly also say that quanta is related to something that we call Planck's constant, which is h, which I've proposed several times, is inversely proportional to the speed of light. So while speed of light sets an upper bound to our material existence, the inverse of that, h, creates a lower bound, which in fact is that lower bound from which matter can parcel itself out in through quanta into more and more um, material form and to the infinite diversity of material form.
But the point being that it's all framed, the medium for this is light. So if we begin to develop a different kind of relationship with light, if we understand what light is more intimately, my proposal is that we can change things much more easily. Why do I say that? Because light is fundamental.
So, getting to this point here, that when we think about light, we think about there is a common way in which we approach light, and that's through an understanding of our science, that's through its technological applications. But what's being suggested here is that there's a third way, and that's through personal relationship. And so light is not just this thing that's severed from reality that we have to observe from a distance, but it's intimate to reality and it's in each of us. And a lot of what we are, everything that we are, emerges from this light. Therefore, we should be able to develop a relationship with it. And the implications of developing a relationship with such an intelligent medium from which everything arises can be pretty profound.
Fundamentally agnostic to power. Light doesn't care where you come from. It doesn't care what the color of your skin is. It's the most democratic instrument. It doesn't care.
The point being made here is that in this relationship that one develops with light, so light is in a sense almost like a it's a real thing. I don't want to use the word to but it's like a massive entity, if you will. It's intelligent. It has all this infinite information. It's capable of a relationship, and it, in a sense, everything that arises in it is equal to it, meaning that it doesn't care what a particular emergence here versus an emergence there. These are all equal emergences, and so it's the most democratic medium, or it allows the most effective means of democracy to actually arise if one can connect to this fundamental layer of light that underlies everything. And it can afford its emergences that become aware of it a extraordinary amount of power when you compare it to the amount of power that, say, a human being believing that they're just a small entity without access to something like light could have, versus a human being who might see light differently and understand that light has a very practical power and that it's approachable, and that in a sense things that are happening in life can be offered to it, and it can take action based on a fuller view of what needs to be done with that circumstance. So the kind of possibilities then become something different.
Care what your bank balance is. And if you can access it, then you can have the power to change things just by visualizing light in a particular kind of way. Now, I had accidentally tapped into this process of seeing a person in a sphere of light, and then something changed. But what I want to propose to you is that when you get into any kind of difficult situation going forward, just simply remember that and re-see that situation in real time or in retrospect or before going into it in a sphere of light. And then
So here's a practical suggestion that we all have different kinds of problems, different kinds of issues that arise on a daily basis. And the suggestion here is to simply re see that situation in light to the degree that we can. Now, that's like a muscle that needs to be built, but the more we practice it, the easier perhaps it can become. And the point being is that when we do that, then we should first of all approach it scientifically, meaning that, certainly don't take my word for it, but just try it on two situations that are similar, or rather try it on one and then don't try it on another, but both those situations are similar, and see for yourself what kind of outcome results on the situation where you did apply light in a particular kind of way. And here I'm suggesting that this happens because the information field of that situation or circumstance that's engulfed in light actually changes.
the information field that surrounds that circumstance, that connects you with that circumstance, will begin to change, and that situation is going to have a chance to evolve differently. But don't take my word for it. Try it. Try it on a couple of situations that are similar, and on one situation, experiment with seeing it in light. In another situation, don't, and begin to see how these situations might evolve differently. And if you do, I want to propose that, in fact, something of the power of light to make change happen might get revealed to you.
So that's the point. The point is that light is, in a sense, a massive living entity from which our universe itself arises, due to the process of light projecting itself at slower and slower speeds. In that process, there's this quantum phenomenon which then arbitrates subtle information into more material form. And so there's a relationship that in fact can be developed with light. And so the proposal is that we don't just think about light scientifically, we don't think about it just technologically, but we also, because it subsumes everything, because everything is in it, because everything arises in it, it's possible to develop a personal relationship with it, which in fact can have a profound impact on everything in our lives, and also then becomes, in a sense, the means for creating a true and sustainable democracy as well.